Crystal clinks softly. Rain pounds against glass windows. Man, low, calm. You know what happens when someone poisons a glass meant for me? Woman, controlled, barely breathing. I didn't poison anything. Man, you counted the seconds. You knocked it over on purpose. Woman, if I hadn't, you'd already be dead. Man, leaning closer. Then explain why a waitress just saved the life of the most dangerous man in this room. Woman, whisper. Because I have a daughter, and I don't let innocent people die. That was the moment Lila Cross stopped being invisible. Welcome to Afro-Korean Story Vault, lovelies. If you love dark romance where danger and desire collide, hit that subscribe button. This story is about to get intense. The rain had started 3 hours before Lila's shift ended, and by the time she walked through the kitchen doors of the Silver Aster, her shoes were soaked through. She didn't complain. Complaints got you noticed, and being noticed was the one thing Lila Cross could not afford. She moved through the private dining club like a shadow, refilling water glasses before they were empty, clearing plates before anyone had to ask, maintaining the precise level of presence that made wealthy people feel served without ever remembering who had served them. Invisibility was survival. It had been for 3 years now. The Silver Aster catered exclusively to New Avalon's elite. Tech moguls, pharmaceutical executives, politicians who preferred their dealings off the record, the kind of people who paid $100,000 for annual membership just to eat in rooms without windows, where privacy was guaranteed and silence was enforced. Lila had learned every face, every pattern, every unspoken rule. She knew which members tipped in cash, which ones never looked her in the eye, which ones would complain if their fork had the slightest water spot. She knew how to anticipate needs before they were spoken, how to be present without being seen. Tonight should have been like any other night. But then Kade Moriyama walked through the door, and everything changed. She felt him before she saw him, a shift in the air, a tightening of invisible threads. The hostess straightened her spine. The bartender stopped mid-pour. Even the senior waitstaff moved with a sharper focus, as if everyone in the building had been reminded that they were being watched. Lila kept her head down, refilling wine at table 7, but her peripheral vision tracked him across the main floor. Tall, maybe 6'2", dark suit that looked like it cost more than her rent for a year. Black hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from stone. All sharp angles and controlled stillness. He moved like a predator who knew exactly how much space he owned. Kade Moriyama, CEO of Moriyama Holdings, one of the largest biotech conglomerates in the world. She'd seen his face in business journals, in patent filings, in the kinds of documents she'd memorized back when her life was different. Back when she had a real name, a real career, a real future. Back when she was Dr. Lila Hartman, not Lila Cross, the waitress. She turned away, focusing on her tables, but her manager intercepted her before she reached the kitchen. Marcus was sweating despite the air conditioning, his collar damp against his neck. Cross. His voice was tight. You're being reassigned. Private dining room 3. VIP service. Mr. Moriyama specifically requested our most discreet server. Lila's stomach dropped. I'm already covering 7 tables. Daniels will take them. You're on 3. Now. Marcus thrust a leather folder into her hands. Wine pairings are pre-selected. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make eye contact. And for God's sake, don't spill anything. There was no room for argument. Lila nodded, collected the specialized serving cart, and moved toward the private wing. Her mind raced. Discreet meant they didn't want anyone who might repeat what they heard. VIP meant power. Moriyama meant danger. She paused outside the heavy oak door, steadying her breathing, smoothing her expression into perfect neutrality. Her reflection stared back from the polished brass handle. Dark hair pulled tight, makeup minimal, the kind of face designed to be forgotten. Then she knocked twice and entered. The private dining room was all dark wood and soft lighting, designed to make powerful people feel like they were in a secret worth keeping. 5 men sat around the circular table, their conversations stopping the moment she appeared. The air smelled of expensive cologne and aged whiskey. Kade Moriyama sat facing the door. His eyes found hers immediately, and for one terrible second, Lila felt completely exposed. Not looked at, seen, analyzed, catalogued. She dropped her gaze and began setting up the wine service with mechanical precision. "Gentlemen," Kade said, his voice low and unnervingly calm, "shall we continue?" The conversation resumed, but Lila's hands trembled slightly as she poured water into crystal glasses. She recognized 2 of the other men from financial news coverage, Richard Chen, a venture capitalist with ties to half the tech startups in the city, and Marcus Holloway, whose pharmaceutical company had been in the news for an insider trading scandal. The others were unfamiliar, but their body language told her everything, deference mixed with barely concealed ambition. This wasn't a dinner. It was a negotiation. "The Axiom acquisition should be finalized by end of quarter," one of the men was saying. Gray-haired, expensive watch, too bright smile. "Legal is cleaning up the patent disputes now." Lila's hand froze for a fraction of a second before she forced herself to keep moving. Axiom Biolabs, her old company, the place that had destroyed her life. She set down the wine bottle with careful precision and stepped back against the wall, making herself small, making herself nothing. But her pulse hammered in her ears. "And the research teams?" Kade asked, swirling wine in his glass without drinking. "Most have been absorbed or terminated. A few key researchers are unaccounted for, but they're not relevant to core operations." The gray-haired man leaned forward. "The intellectual property is what matters. We're talking about revolutionary neural interface technology. The patents alone justify the purchase price." Lila poured more water, keeping her face blank even as her mind spun. They were talking about her colleagues, people she'd worked with, people who'd been scattered or silenced when Axiom's leadership decided to steal her research and frame her for corporate espionage, rather than give her credit for the breakthrough that would make them billions. "The neural compounds," Kade said. "Walk me through the applications again." Richard Chen pulled out a tablet, swiping through data. Direct brain-computer interfaces, medical applications for paralysis patients, cognitive enhancement, memory augmentation. The military contracts alone could be worth billions. But the real value is in the consumer market. Imagine controlling your phone, your car, your entire smart home with just your thoughts. Her compounds, her research, the work she'd poured 5 years of her life into, now being discussed like it had always belonged to them. Lila refilled wine glasses, moving around the table like a ghost, and caught Kade's eyes flicking to her again. Just for a moment, measuring her reaction. She kept her face blank, but something tightened in her chest. He was too observant, too aware. She'd seen men like him before, men who noticed everything, who treated every interaction like a chess game, who never stopped calculating. Marcus Holloway cleared his throat. "What about the safety concerns? There were rumors about side effects during the clinical trials." "Nothing we can't manage," Chen said dismissively. "A few subjects experienced headaches, some minor seizures. Standard for any neural interface testing. The FDA will want more trials, but we can expedite that with the right connections." Lila's jaw clenched. Those minor seizures had been catastrophic failures. 2 test subjects had died because Axiom had rushed the trials, ignoring her warnings about proper dosing protocols. She'd reported it. She'd documented everything. And she'd been punished for it. The door opened, and the final guest arrived. "Apologies for the delay," the man said smoothly, shaking rain from his coat. Traffic was murder. Lila looked up and felt her blood turn to ice. Ethan Hale. He was smiling, polished and charming in the way that had always made her skin crawl. Tall, blonde, with the kind of perfect features that made people trust him instinctively. He'd been Axiom's head of investor relations, the man who'd stood in front of the board and accused her of theft, who'd presented falsified documents with her forged signature, who'd looked her in the eye and lied so convincingly that even she had almost doubted herself. And now he was here, sitting down at Kade Moriyama's table like they were old friends. Lila turned away, pouring water, keeping her face carefully neutral. But her mind raced. Ethan wouldn't recognize her. She looked different now. Darker hair, no makeup, 20 pounds thinner from stress and single motherhood. She was a waitress, a nobody beneath his notice. She'd served him twice before at the Silver Aster, and both times he'd looked straight through her. But if he did recognize her, she pushed the thought away and focused on being invisible. "Mr. Hale," Kade said, his tone unreadable. "Good of you to join us." "Wouldn't miss it." Ethan settled into his chair, accepting the wine glass Lila placed in front of him without a glance. "This acquisition is going to change everything. Moriyama Holdings and Axiom's technology will own the neural interface market within 18 months. Every tech company, every government agency, every hospital system will come to us." The conversation shifted to projections and profit margins. Ethan dominated the discussion, painting a picture of a future where Axiom's technology, her technology, would revolutionize human existence. He spoke with the confidence of a man who believed his own lies, who'd convinced himself that the research he'd stolen was rightfully his. Lila refilled wine glasses and tried not to imagine throwing the entire bottle at his head. Kade remained silent through most of Ethan's pitch, asking occasional questions, his expression unreadable. But Lila noticed the way he watched Ethan. Not with trust, with calculation, like he was waiting for something. The appetizers arrived and Lila served them with practiced efficiency. Seared scallops, microgreens, some kind of foam that probably cost $50 a plate. The men barely noticed the food. They were too busy discussing market share and stock prices and how much money they'd make from technology that didn't belong to them. Lila was clearing the appetizer plates when Ethan reached into his jacket pocket. The movement was casual, natural, the kind of gesture no one would think twice about. But Lila had spent years in research labs, watching people handle delicate materials, learning to spot the difference between routine and calculated. And this was calculated. Ethan pulled out a small case, brushed metal, unmarked, the size of a business card holder. He opened it with one hand while gesturing with the other, explaining something about quarterly projections. Inside the case were 3 microvials, each no larger than a pill capsule. Lila's breath stopped, clear liquid with a faint violet shimmer. She knew that shimmer, knew it in her bones, in the years she'd spent perfecting the compound. In the nights she'd documented every molecular variation. NT47, a neurotoxin she'd developed as part of her research into neural pathway blockers. In medical doses, it could treat degenerative brain conditions, potentially reversing damage from Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. In concentrated form, it was lethal, untraceable, fast-acting, mimicking a natural stroke or heart attack. And Ethan Hale was holding it like it was nothing. She watched, frozen, as he palmed one of the vials with practiced ease. Watched as he leaned forward to make a point about market penetration, his hand passing over Kade's wine glass. Watched as 3 drops, maybe 4, fell into the deep red liquid, dissolving instantly. The violet shimmer vanished into the wine like it had never existed. No one else noticed. Chen was scrolling through his tablet. Holloway was checking his phone. The gray-haired man was cutting his steak. Kade was looking at a contract, his wine glass sitting untouched beside his plate. Ethan settled back in his chair, closing the case, sliding it back into his pocket. His smile never wavered. Lila's mind screamed at her to stay silent, to look away, to let it happen. This was Kade Moriyama, a man who built empires by consuming smaller companies, who'd just spent the last hour discussing the acquisition that had destroyed her life. A man who represented everything she'd learned to fear about corporate power. A man who would buy Axiom, profit from her stolen research, and never know her name. Why should she save him? But she also knew what NT-47 did to the human body. Knew the seizures, the brain hemorrhaging, the way consciousness would slip away in minutes. Knew that no one would suspect poison because the compound was supposed to be locked in a research vault, not dissolved in wine at a business dinner. Knew that whoever had planned this, whoever had given Ethan access to her research, was willing to commit murder to stop this acquisition. And she knew that if she let this happen, she'd be standing here when Kade Moriyama started convulsing. When his eyes rolled back. When he died right in front of her. She thought of Nina, her 6-year-old daughter, asleep in their tiny apartment. Thought of the promise she'd made when they'd gone into hiding, that she would keep them both safe, that she would never draw attention, that they would survive by being no one. Every instinct she'd developed over 3 years of running told her to stay silent, to be invisible, to survive. But she also thought of the man who'd once told her, back when she'd been Dr. Lila Hartman and the world had made sense, that the measure of a person wasn't what they did when it was easy. It was what they did when the cost was everything. Her father had said that 2 weeks before he died. Before cancer had taken him. Before she'd had to face the world alone. She thought of him now, and she thought of Nina, and she thought of the woman she'd been before fear had turned her into a ghost. Lila reached for the water pitcher. Her hand shook as she lifted it, moving toward Kade's side of the table. He was still reading the contract, his wine glass sitting inches from his hand. In a few minutes, he'd reach for it. He'd take a drink, and then it would be too late. "More water, sir?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kade glanced up at her, and in that fraction of a second, she saw his eyes narrow, intelligent, assessing, dangerous. He'd heard something in her voice, some tremor of tension that didn't belong. She stumbled. The water pitcher tipped, its contents spilling directly across the table. Ice and water flooded over the white linen, racing toward Kade's plate, his papers, his wine glass. The glass shattered against the table edge. Red liquid spread across white fabric, mixing with water and melting ice cubes. Chaos erupted instantly. Men jumped back from the table, chairs scraping. Chen grabbed his tablet before water could reach it. Holloway swore, brushing water off his suit. The gray-haired man looked horrified. Ethan's face went pale, then carefully neutral. His eyes flicked to the shattered wine glass, to the spreading red stain, to Lila's trembling hands. Calculating. Kade sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on Lila's face. Not angry, not surprised, watching her like she was a puzzle he'd just figured out. "I'm so sorry," Lila gasped, grabbing napkins from the serving cart, trying to contain the spill. Her heart hammered so hard she thought everyone must hear it. "I'm so sorry. I'll get cleaning supplies. I'll replace the wine immediately." "Stop!" Kade's voice cut through the commotion like a blade. Everyone froze. He stood slowly, still watching her with those 2 sharp eyes. Water dripped from the table edge onto his shoes. The shattered wine glass glittered in the puddle of red. "Everyone out," Kade said quietly. "Now." "Kade, it's fine." Ethan started, his voice smooth, concerned. "It was just an accident. We can continue." "I said out." There was no anger in Kade's voice, which somehow made it more terrifying. Pure command. Absolute authority. "The dinner is over. My assistant will reschedule." The men exchanged glances but began gathering their things. No one argued with Kade Moriyama when he used that tone. Chen grabbed his tablet. Holloway straightened his jacket. The gray-haired man muttered something about his dry cleaning bill. Ethan lingered, his gaze flicking between Kade and Lila, calculating the angles. Really, it's just spilled wine. No need to end the evening over. Mr. Hale. Kade's tone dropped several degrees, frost layering every syllable. Leave. For a moment, Ethan's perfect mask slipped. Lila saw frustration flash across his face, quickly hidden behind concern. Of course. I'll call tomorrow about rescheduling. He looked at Lila, really looked at her for the first time, and she saw his eyes narrow slightly. Recognition flickering but not quite catching. Not yet. Then he was gone, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. The silence in the room was deafening. Lila stood frozen, still holding soaked napkins, her mind racing through exit strategies. She could run, make it to the kitchen, out the back door, disappear before he could stop her. She'd done it before. She could do it again. But Kade moved between her and the door, not blocking it, not threatening, just present, inescapable. Look at me. It wasn't a request. Lila raised her eyes slowly, and the intensity of his gaze nearly made her step back. He knew. Somehow he knew exactly what she'd done and why. You counted the seconds, Kade said quietly, his voice low enough that no one outside the room could possibly hear. After he dropped something in my glass. You counted, and then you knocked it over. On purpose. Lila's throat closed. Her mind screamed denials, excuses, anything to deflect. I don't know what you... Don't. He moved closer, not threatening, just absolute. Unavoidable. I've spent 20 years learning to read people, and you just saved my life. So I'll ask once, what did you see? The silence stretched. Lila's mind spun through options. Lie, deflect, run. But those eyes pinned her in place like a butterfly to a board. And something in her, some part of her that had been drowning in invisibility for 3 years, wanted to be seen. Wanted to be known. Wanted someone to understand what it cost to save a stranger's life when you'd spent so long learning to save only yourself. A micro-vial, she whispered. Clear liquid with violet shimmer. He dropped it in your wine when he leaned forward during the market share discussion. 3 or 4 drops, probably enough to... She stopped herself. Enough to what? Kill you. The words came out flat. Factual. Within 20 minutes, it would look like a stroke or cardiac event, completely untraceable if you don't know what to look for. The air between them crystallized with understanding. Kade's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. A coiling of tension, like a predator recognizing another predator. And you know what to look for because... This was it. The moment where her careful invisibility shattered completely. Where 3 years of running, hiding, erasing herself collapsed into dust. Lila looked at this man, this stranger who could destroy her with a phone call, and made a choice. Because I created it, she said. That compound, 5 years ago, at Axiom Biolabs. Kade's eyes widened fractionally, the first genuine surprise she'd seen from him. You worked at Axiom. Past tense, very past tense. Doing what? Neurochemical research, neural interface compounds. The same technology your company is acquiring along with everything else Axiom stole from people like me. The words came out harder than she'd intended, 3 years of buried rage bleeding through. I'm guessing that wasn't in the due diligence reports. His eyes narrowed, processing, calculating. They stole from you. They stole my research, falsified documents, framed me for corporate espionage, and destroyed my career. So yes, they stole from me. Lila's hands trembled. She was still holding the soaked napkins, water dripping onto the hardwood floor. And now the man who orchestrated it just tried to murder you with my own creation. Poetic, don't you think? What's your name? Kade asked. Lila Cross. Your real name. She hesitated. Saying it out loud after 3 years felt like ripping off a bandage from a wound that had never properly healed. But she'd already crossed the line. Already exposed herself. What was one more secret? Dr. Lila Hartman. Recognition flickered across his face. The researcher who disappeared during Axiom's patent litigation. There was a warrant. Based on false evidence planted by the same people who are now selling you my work. Lila dropped the napkins onto the table. I didn't steal anything. I created it, and they took it. And when I wouldn't sign away the rights, they made sure I couldn't fight back. So you became a waitress. I became invisible. There's a difference. She met his eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't look away first. And I need to stay invisible, which means this conversation needs to end. I saved your life. You can repay me by forgetting I exist. She turned toward the door, but his voice stopped her. You think I'm going to let you walk away? Lila's blood ran cold. She turned slowly. You don't own me. No, but you just witnessed an assassination attempt on my life, and you have information about the poison used and the man who used it. Information I need. He moved closer, not aggressive, but his presence filled the space completely. Which means you're not leaving until we finish this conversation. I have a daughter waiting for me at home. The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she saw his expression shift. Something almost like understanding crossing his face. Then we'll make this quick, he said. You tell me everything you know about Ethan Hale, about Axiom Biolabs, and about that compound. In exchange, I'll make sure you and your daughter stay safe. Safe from what? From whoever ordered Hale to kill me tonight. From Axiom's lawyers who might still be looking for you. From the consequences of breaking your invisibility to save my life. His voice dropped. You're exposed now, Dr. Hartman. The question is whether you face that exposure alone or with resources behind you. Lila's mind raced. He was right. The moment she'd intervened, she'd painted a target on herself. Ethan might not have recognized her yet, but he would. He'd investigate. He'd ask questions. He'd run her face through databases. And eventually, he'd realize that the waitress who'd accidentally destroyed the poisoned wine was the same researcher who disappeared 3 years ago. The same researcher who could testify about what really happened at Axiom. The same researcher who knew exactly what compound he'd used and how he'd obtained it. What do you want from me? She asked. Right now, information. After that, Kade's eyes held hers. We'll see. It wasn't reassurance. It was a warning and a promise wrapped together, and Lila felt the weight of it settle over her like a cage she'd walked into with her eyes open. There's a back entrance, Kade said. My car is waiting. We talk somewhere private, somewhere safe. Then I take you home. And if I refuse? Then you walk out that door, and I call the police about an attempted poisoning. They'll want a witness statement. They'll want your real name, your background, where you've been for 3 years. He tilted his head. Is that what you want? Lila's jaw clenched. He'd backed her into a corner so smoothly she hadn't even felt the walls closing in. You're blackmailing me. I'm offering you a choice. There's a difference. Not much of one. No, Kade agreed, something almost like regret flickering across his face. Not much of one at all. The rain had intensified by the time they stepped into the alley behind the Silver Aster. Lila's uniform was soaked within seconds, but she barely noticed. Her entire focus was on the black SUV idling in the shadows. On the way, Kade's hand hovered near her elbow without quite touching, on the reality that she was about to get into a car with one of the most powerful men in the city. A man someone had just tried to kill. A man who now knew exactly who she was. The door opened, and warm air spilled out from the interior. Lila hesitated on the threshold, every instinct screaming at her to run. She could still disappear. Take Nina, empty their bank account, buy bus tickets with cash, start over somewhere new. They'd done it once. They could do it again. But then what? Run for another 3 years? 5? 10? Spend the rest of Nina's childhood looking over her shoulder, moving from city to city, never staying long enough to make friends or put down roots. Your daughter, Kade said quietly, rain running down his face. What's her name? Lila's heart stuttered. Why? Because if I'm going to protect you, I need to protect her too. And that starts with knowing who she is. It was the most terrifying thing he could have said. Not a threat, but an acknowledgement that he understood exactly what leverage he held. That he knew her weakness, her breaking point, the one thing in the world that would make her stay instead of run. Nina, Lila whispered. Her name is Nina. Kade nodded once, then gestured to the car. After you. Lila climbed in, and the door closed behind her with a soft, final click. The interior was all leather and dark wood, separated from the driver by a privacy screen. Kade settled across from her, his presence filling the space completely. Water dripped from his hair onto his collar, but he seemed not to notice. The car pulled smoothly into traffic, and Lila watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows. Somewhere out there, Nina was asleep in their apartment, unaware that her mother's carefully constructed invisibility had just shattered completely. Unaware that everything was about to change. Start with Ethan Hale, Kade said. How do you know him? Lila took a breath and began talking. She told him about Axiom, about her research, about the neural interface compounds that could revolutionize how humans interacted with technology. She told him about the breakthrough, the moment when she'd finally cracked the code that had eluded researchers for decades, when she'd created a compound that could bridge the gap between human neurons and digital systems without causing the catastrophic rejection responses that had plagued earlier attempts. She told him about the day she'd presented her findings to the board, about the way Ethan had smiled at her, congratulated her, promised her that Axiom would take care of everything, about how naive she'd been to trust him. They wanted the patents without paying for them, she explained, watching rain streak down the windows. My contract had a clause about shared ownership of developments, but my lawyer said I had a strong case for full ownership based on the preliminary work I'd done before joining Axiom. The breakthrough built on research I'd started in graduate school, so they found another way. They framed you. Ethan specifically. He was good at it too. Very good. Lila's voice hardened. He planted evidence on my work computer, encrypted files that supposedly contained my research being sent to a Chinese pharmaceutical company. He forged transfer records showing payments to an offshore account in my name. He created a paper trail that made it look like I'd been selling corporate secrets for months. And no one questioned it? Why would they? Ethan was head of investor relations, charming, trusted. I was just a researcher. And the evidence was incredibly detailed. Bank statements, email chains, even meeting records showing me in contact with people I'd never heard of. She laughed bitterly. The federal investigators showed up at my apartment at 6 a.m. I was making breakfast for Nina. She was 3 years old, in her pajamas, and suddenly there were men with guns in our kitchen. Kade's expression darkened. What happened? My lawyer told me to cooperate fully, that we'd clear everything up. But the more I tried to explain, the worse it got. The evidence was overwhelming. And then I found out that Axiom's legal team had already filed for the patents in their name, claiming my research as work for hire. Lila's hands clenched in her lap. I realized I was going to lose. The case would take years, cost millions I didn't have, and even if I won eventually, I'd be broke and unemployable by the end. You ran. I had a 6-month-old daughter and no way to fight a case that would destroy us both. So yes, I ran. Cashed out everything, bought fake IDs, changed our names, disappeared into a city big enough to be invisible in. She met his eyes. I became Lila Cross. Dr. Lila Hartman ceased to exist. Until tonight. Until tonight. She agreed quietly. The car slowed and Lila realized they'd stopped in an underground parking garage. Concrete and shadows and the kind of private space where no one asked questions. Expensive cars lined the walls. Everything was pristine, controlled, expensive. "Where are we?" she asked. "Somewhere we can talk without being interrupted." Kade's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, his expression unreadable. "I have a team running background on Hale and investigating Axiom's security protocols. But I need you to tell me everything you remember about who had access to your research and who would want me dead. That could be a very long list." "Then we'd better get started." They ended up in what Kade called a safe room, a corporate apartment that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that luxury was the best camouflage. Neutral colors, expensive furniture, no personal touches. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the city spreading out below them, a carpet of light stretching to the horizon. The kind of place that existed purely as a function. A space to conduct business that needed to stay off the books. Lila stood by the window, looking out at the city lights while Kade made coffee in the adjoining kitchen. She should have been terrified. Should have been planning escape routes, thinking about how to get back to Nina. How to disappear again deeper this time. But instead, she felt a strange, dangerous calm settling over her. For 3 years, she'd been running, hiding, erasing herself piece by piece to keep Nina safe. Working endless shifts at the Silver Aster for cash tips because she couldn't risk a paper trail. Living in a tiny apartment in a bad neighborhood because it was all she could afford without references or credit history. Teaching Nina to never use their real names, to never talk about mommy's old job, to never tell anyone where they came from. And now, in the space of one evening, she'd broken every rule she'd set for herself. She'd been seen, she'd been known, she'd been caught. And somehow, she was still breathing. "Here." Kade handed her a mug, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The coffee was black, strong, exactly what she needed. "You look like you need it." "What I need is to go home to my daughter. Soon." He settled into a chair across from her, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. Always watching, always calculating. "First, we establish what happens next. What happens next is I disappear again, deeper this time. That won't work anymore." "Why not?" "Because Ethan Hale saw you. He may not have recognized you tonight, but he will. He'll run facial recognition, background checks, cross-reference staff records with Axiom's old employee database. He'll find out that Lila Cross looks remarkably similar to Dr. Lila Hartman, and then he'll know you witnessed his attempt on my life." Kade's voice was matter of fact, but the implications were devastating. "You can't hide from that." Lila's hands tightened around the mug. "So what do you suggest? You work for me, officially, publicly, under your real name." She nearly dropped the coffee. "That's insane. That's protection. If you're associated with Moriyama Holdings, Hale can't touch you without going through me first. And trust me, Dr. Hartman, he doesn't want to go through me. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you survival. There's a difference." There was that phrase again, turned back on her like a weapon she'd forged herself. Lila studied his face, trying to read the calculation behind those dark eyes. "What's in it for you?" "Information. Access to your research. Help navigating Axiom's intellectual property during the acquisition." He paused, taking a sip of his own coffee. And someone I can trust who knows when I'm being poisoned. You don't trust anyone. I trust capability. You proved yours tonight. Kade set down his mug, leaning forward slightly. You recognized a compound you created 5 years ago from 3 drops in a wine glass, in dim lighting, while pretending to be invisible. That's not luck. That's expertise. And I need that expertise to understand exactly what I'm buying when I acquire Axiom. You're asking me to work for the company that's acquiring the research that was stolen from me. That's ironic? Yes. Also strategic. Kade's eyes held hers. If Moriyama Holdings owns Axiom's assets, that means we'll own your research. And I'm willing to negotiate terms that give you proper credit and compensation for your work. Something Axiom never did. The words hit like a physical blow. Lila had spent 3 years telling herself that her research was gone, that she'd never see recognition for the work that had consumed her life, that the breakthrough she'd achieved would always belong to the people who'd stolen it. And now this man, this dangerous, calculating man, was offering it back like it was a simple business transaction. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do that? Because I build empires by recognizing value others miss. You're Dr. Lila Hartman, one of the most innovative neurochemical researchers of your generation. You disappeared, but your work didn't. It's been generating billions in potential value while you served wine to people who should have been begging you to work for them. His voice was matter-of-fact, almost cold in its pragmatism. I don't waste valuable assets. I'm not an asset. I'm a person. You're both, and you saved my life tonight. I'm returning the favor. By trapping me in your world. By giving you a world where you don't have to hide anymore. Kade stood, moving to the window beside her. The city stretched out below them, a sea of lights and possibilities. You've been running for 3 years, Dr. Hartman. Aren't you tired? Lila was. God, she was so tired. Tired of looking over her shoulder, tired of living half a life, tired of explaining to Nina why they couldn't stay in one place, why Mommy didn't have any friends, why their names were different from the ones in the old photographs Nina sometimes found hidden in shoeboxes. Tired of being no one when she'd once been someone who mattered. But she was also terrified of what it meant to stop running, of what it meant to be visible again, of what it would cost to step back into the light after spending so long in shadows. I need to think about it, she said finally. You have until morning. After that, Hale will have had time to investigate, and your window for protection closes. Kade's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at it, his expression darkening. My security team just sent preliminary results. Ethan Hale made 3 phone calls in the last hour. 1 to Axiom's current CEO, 1 to a burner phone we can't trace, and 1 to a private investigator who specializes in locating people who don't want to be found. Lila's blood turned to ice. He knows. He suspects. By morning, he'll know. Kade pocketed his phone. My driver will take you home. Think about what I said. Think about what's best for Nina. The mention of her daughter's name made everything inside Lila tighten with fear and fury. Don't use her as leverage. I'm not. I'm reminding you that you're not the only one who needs protection anymore. His voice softened fractionally, the first hint of something approaching empathy she'd heard from him. You broke your invisibility to save me, Dr. Hartman. Let me repay that by making sure you and your daughter survive what comes next. The drive home was silent except for the rain. Lila sat in the back of the SUV, watching the city blur past, her mind spinning through scenarios and outcomes, and the terrible realization that Kade was right about everything. She couldn't run anymore, couldn't hide, couldn't pretend to be no one. Ethan would find her, and when he did, he wouldn't just destroy her, he'd destroy Nina too. Would use her daughter as leverage, as a weapon, as proof that Lila had something to lose and he held all the cards. Unless she had something stronger than invisibility. Unless she had power. The car stopped outside her apartment building, a rundown complex in a neighborhood that never quite felt safe, but was all she could afford on a waitress's salary. Graffiti marked the walls. The security door had been broken for months, the kind of place where people minded their own business because getting involved meant trouble. The driver opened her door, and Lila stepped out into the rain. She looked up at the building, at the third-floor window where a dim light glowed. Nina was up there, probably already asleep, unaware that their entire world had just shifted on its axis. Dr. Hartman. She turned. Kade had lowered the window, his face half-shadowed in the darkness. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "My office, 9 a.m., 38th floor of Moriyama Tower. Security will be expecting you. Don't be late." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. It was an inevitability, and they both knew it. Lila nodded once, then turned and walked into her building, feeling his eyes on her back until the door closed between them. Inside the apartment, Nina was indeed asleep, her small form curled under blankets covered in cartoon stars. Lila stood in the doorway, watching her daughter breathe, feeling the weight of every choice she'd made tonight crushing down on her shoulders. She'd saved a man's life, and in doing so, she'd lost the invisibility that had kept them safe for 3 years. But maybe, she'd found something else. Something that looked like protection, but felt like a cage. Something that promised survival, but demanded everything in return. Lila walked to Nina's bedside and brushed hair from her daughter's forehead. Nina stirred, mumbling something in her sleep about purple elephants and ice cream. So innocent, so unaware of how close they'd come to losing everything. "I'll keep you safe," Lila whispered. "No matter what it costs, I promise." She thought about Kade's eyes, about the way he'd seen through her so completely. Thought about Ethan Hale and the poison that had been meant for someone else, about 3 phone calls and a private investigator and time running out. Thought about 3 years of hiding and the exhaustion that came with constantly erasing yourself. And she thought about her research, her work, her breakthrough, her legacy, sitting in corporate vaults with someone else's name on it, generating billions for people who'd destroyed her life. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. She had until then to decide if she was brave enough to stop disappearing, or if the cost of being seen again was more than she could afford to pay. Lila closed Nina's door softly and moved to her own room. She didn't sleep. Couldn't. She sat by the window, watching the city lights and the rain, her mind churning through possibilities. If she went to Kade's office tomorrow, she was accepting his offer, accepting his protection, his terms, his world. She'd be trading one form of control for another. Instead of hiding from Axiom's lawyers, she'd be bound to Moriyama Holdings. Instead of being invisible by choice, she'd be visible at Kade's discretion. But she'd also have resources, legal protection, access to her own research, a chance to clear her name and maybe, just maybe, reclaim the career that had been stolen from her. And Nina would be safe. That was what mattered. Not her pride, not her fear of losing control, not even her justifiable anger at being backed into a corner. Nina's safety trumped everything else. Lila pulled out her phone, a cheap prepaid burner she replaced every few months, and looked up Moriyama Tower. 38 floors of glass and steel in the financial district. One of the most recognizable buildings in New Avalon, a monument to the kind of power and wealth she'd spent 3 years hiding from. And tomorrow morning, she was going to walk through its doors. She thought about what to wear. Her wardrobe consisted of her silver Aster uniform, cheap jeans, discount store t-shirts. Nothing appropriate for a meeting with a CEO. Nothing that said, "I'm Dr. Lila Hartman and I'm taking my life back." But maybe that was the point. Maybe showing up as herself, exhausted, broke, running on borrowed time, was exactly what Kade needed to see. A reminder that she wasn't doing this for ambition or revenge. She was doing it because she had no other choice. She was doing it because a 6-year-old girl needed her mother to survive. The rain finally stopped around 4 in the morning. Lila watched the sky lighten from black to gray to pale pink. Watched the city wake up around her. Watched delivery trucks and early commuters and joggers brave enough to face the wet streets. She thought about the last time she'd watched a sunrise like this. 5 years ago, in her lab at Axiom, after a breakthrough so significant she'd worked through the night documenting it. She'd been so excited she couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything except the possibilities her research opened up. She'd called her father, even though it was early, even though he'd been sick. He'd answered on the second ring, his voice weak but proud. "You did it, Lila," he'd said. "You actually did it." "I did," she'd whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, this could change everything. This could help so many people." "It will, because you're brilliant, and you're good, and you never give up." He'd coughed, the sound wet and painful. "Promise me something, sweetheart. Promise me you'll fight for this. Don't let anyone take it from you." She'd promised. And then she'd broken that promise by running instead of fighting. But maybe it wasn't too late to keep it. Lila stood, her decision crystallizing. She wasn't going to Kade's office because she was trapped. She was going because she was choosing to fight, to reclaim what was hers, to be Dr. Lila Hartman again, even if it meant accepting help from a man who saw her as an asset, even if it meant stepping into a world more dangerous than the one she'd been hiding from. She checked on Nina one more time, then went to wake Mrs. Chen across the hall, an elderly woman who sometimes watched Nina when Lila's shifts ran late. Mrs. Chen asked no questions, accepted cash payments, and had never once called Lila by anything other than dear. "Emergency shift?" Lila lied, handing over 220s. "I'll be back by afternoon." Mrs. Chen nodded, already shuffling toward Lila's apartment. "Take your time, dear. Nina and I will make pancakes." By 8:30, Lila was showered, dressed in her least-worn jeans and a black sweater that didn't have any visible stains. She'd pulled her hair back, applied minimal makeup, and looked at herself in the mirror one last time. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who'd been running for 3 years and was finally turning around to face what she'd been running from. Good enough. The subway ride to the financial district felt surreal. Lila watched business people in expensive suits, young professionals with their coffee and smartphones, tourists taking pictures of the skyline. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that the woman standing next to them had witnessed an attempted murder 12 hours ago. Unaware that she'd created the poison used for that murder. Unaware that she was about to walk into a meeting that could either save her life or destroy it completely. Moriyama Tower loomed above her, all glass and steel and intimidating architecture. Lila stood on the sidewalk, staring up at it, feeling impossibly small. She thought about Nina, about keeping her safe, about keeping her promise to her father. Then she walked through the revolving doors. The lobby was all marble and minimalist design, the kind of space that made it clear you didn't belong here unless you had serious money or serious power. Security guards in crisp uniforms stood at attention. A reception desk that looked like it cost more than her annual salary dominated the space. Lila approached the desk, her heart hammering. "I'm here to see Kade Moriyama. I have a 9 o'clock appointment." The receptionist, young, beautiful, perfectly polished, typed something into her computer. Her expression shifted from polite professionalism to careful respect. "Dr. Hartman?" Hearing her real name spoken aloud in public after 3 years made Lila's breath catch. "Yes. Mr. Moriyama is expecting you. 38th floor. Security will escort you." The receptionist gestured, and one of the guards materialized at Lila's elbow. The elevator ride was silent. Lila watched the numbers climb, 10, 20, 30, and tried to calm her racing pulse. This was it. The moment where she stopped being Lila Cross and became Dr. Lila Hartman again. The moment where she stopped hiding and started fighting. The elevator doors opened onto a reception area that was somehow both luxurious and austere. Dark wood, leather furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows showing the city spread out below. A woman in her 40s sat behind a desk, her expression professionally neutral. "Dr. Hartman, Mr. Moriyama is ready for you. This way, please." Lila followed her down a hallway lined with abstract art that probably cost more than she'd earned in her entire life. Her hands were sweating. Her mouth was dry. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run, to disappear back into the safety of invisibility. But she kept walking. The door at the end of the hallway opened into an office that was more like a command center. Massive desk, multiple monitors, one entire wall of windows overlooking New Avalon. And standing with his back to the door, looking out at the city, was Kade Moriyama. He turned when she entered, and Lila felt the full force of his attention lock onto her. In the daylight, he was even more imposing than he'd been last night. Perfectly tailored suit, every detail calculated, every movement controlled. "Dr. Hartman," he said, "you came. Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you'd be smart enough to consider all your options. The fact that you're here means you understand the reality of your situation." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Please. Sit." Lila sat, feeling like she was signing away her soul with the simple act of settling into expensive leather. Kade sat across from her, steepling his fingers. "I had my team working through the night. Would you like to hear what we found?" "Do I have a choice?" "Not really." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. Ethan Hale made 17 phone calls last night, most to known associates at Axiom. But 3 were to a man named Marcus Reeves, head of security for Axiom's research division. The same man who would have had access to your NT-47 compound. Lila's stomach clenched. Reeves was the one who escorted me off the premises when they fired me. He took my security badge, my laptop, my lab access. He stood there and watched while I cleaned out my desk. He's also the one who planted the evidence on your computer. We have a forensic analyst who traced the digital fingerprints. Reeves had administrative access to all research terminals. He could have planted anything, backdated anything, fabricated any communication trail he wanted. Kade's voice was clinical, detached. Ethan Hale orchestrated the frame job. Marcus Reeves executed it. And someone higher up in Axiom's leadership authorized it. Who? That's what I need you to help me find out. Kade pulled up something on one of his monitors, turning it so Lila could see. This is Axiom's current organizational chart. I need you to tell me who would have had the authority to approve accessing your research, who would benefit from my death, and who might be pulling strings behind the acquisition. Lila studied the chart, her mind racing. She saw familiar names, people she'd worked with, people who'd smiled at her in the hallways and then turned their backs when she'd been accused of theft. She saw new names, too, executives who'd joined after she'd disappeared. "There," she said, pointing to a name near the top. "Dr. Raymond Chen. He was my direct supervisor. He fought against my ownership claims, said my research was clearly work for hire despite the contract language. He had the most to gain from me disappearing because he was listed as co-developer on the patents even though he never touched my actual research. Chen is currently negotiating terms with my legal team." Kade made a note. "Who else?" "Victoria Strauss, CFO. She's the one who would have approved the budget for my research program. If she knew the potential value of what I was developing, she'd have every reason to want me out of the picture before I could claim ownership. Strauss sold her Axiom stock 3 weeks ago. Large volume, right before the acquisition announcement. Kade's eyes narrowed. That's suspicious timing. They worked through the chart for an hour, Lila identifying key players, Kade cross-referencing with financial data and communication records his team had compiled. It was like assembling a puzzle where every piece revealed another layer of conspiracy. Finally, Kade leaned back in his chair. You understand what this means. If you work for me, you'll be helping me acquire Axiom. You'll be instrumental in the very transaction that finalizes their ownership of your research. Unless you honor your offer to give me proper credit and compensation. I will. But that won't undo 3 years of your life. It won't erase what they did to you. His voice was matter of fact. Can you live with that? Lila thought about it. Really thought about it. About working alongside Kade to acquire the company that had destroyed her. About helping him profit from her stolen research. About the bitter irony of it all. I can live with it, she said finally. If it means Nina stays safe. If it means I get my name back. If it means the people who did this face consequences. Then we have a deal. Kade stood, extending his hand across the desk. Welcome to Moriyama Holdings, Dr. Hartman. Lila stared at his hand for a long moment. This was it, the point of no return. The moment where she stopped being invisible and became something else entirely. She stood and shook his hand. His grip was firm, confident, the handshake of a man who never doubted he'd get what he wanted. I have conditions, Lila said, not releasing his hand. Of course you do. Nina stays out of this. Completely. Whatever happens, whatever you need from me, my daughter remains untouchable and uninvolved. Agreed. I want full access to my research files. Everything Axiom has. I need to know what they've done with my work. You'll have it by end of day. And I want to know who ordered your assassination. Not just Ethan Hale. The person who paid him. The person who wanted you dead. Lila met his eyes. Because if they wanted you dead for buying Axiom, they'll want me dead for helping you. Kade's expression shifted, respect mixing with something darker. That's why you're valuable, Dr. Hartman. You think like someone who's been hunted. That's going to keep both of us alive. He released her hand and moved to the window, looking out at the city. There's one more thing you should know. Ethan Hale was found dead this morning. Apparent suicide. He jumped from his apartment balcony around 5 a.m. Lila's blood turned to ice. That's not a coincidence. No, it's a message. Whoever hired him to kill me is cleaning up loose ends. Kade turned to face her. Which means you're in more danger than I initially thought. Hale would have reported the failed assassination, would have mentioned the waitress who interfered, and now he's dead, which means someone is tying off threads. They'll come for me next. They'll try. Kade's voice hardened. Which is why, as of this moment, you and Nina are under my protection. I'm moving you out of that apartment today. You'll stay in a secure location until we identify who's behind this. You can't just... I can, and I am. This isn't negotiable, Dr. Hartman. Someone just committed murder to protect their interests. I'm not giving them the opportunity to make you their next victim. He pulled out his phone. My security team is already at your building. They'll help you pack. Mrs. Chen will be compensated for her trouble and given a cover story about a family emergency. Lila wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could take care of herself, wanted to maintain some illusion of control. But Ethan Hale was dead, and she knew exactly what that meant. She'd saved Kade's life, and now someone wanted her silenced for it. Okay, she said quietly, but I tell Nina myself, and I explain things in a way she can understand. Of course. Kade's expression softened fractionally. I'm not a monster, Dr. Hartman. I'm just a man who understands that safety requires control, and control requires power. You saved my life. I'm returning the favor. Everything else is just logistics. Lila nodded, feeling the weight of her new reality settle over her. She'd walked into this office as Lila Cross, invisible waitress, and she was leaving as Dr. Lila Hartman, asset of Moriyama Holdings. Protected, valuable, trapped, but alive. And sometimes, survival was enough. This is just the beginning of Lila and Kade's dangerous alliance. If you want more stories where love is a weapon and trust is a luxury no one can afford, subscribe now to Afro-Korean Story Vault. Hit that like button if you're Team Lila, and drop a comment telling me, should she trust Kade, or is she walking into an even more dangerous trap? Part 2, coming soon if this story hits 10K views. See you in the next story.